So, in the world of Islamic terminologies, Khawārij is truly one of the most infamous. Historically, it denotes one of the most notorious factions to ever exist in all of Islamic history. And considering the way the term Khawārij, or Kharijī in the singular, has been used and how it is still in use today in polemically charged and heresiographical writings, it only paints a picture of extremism, brutality, and deviance, such that most Muslims know only this contrived negative image. And Professor Gaiser, if you recognize that last line, I took that from your book, Shurat Ibadi Identities, just because I feel that's exactly how most Muslims, when they hear Khawārij, that's exactly what comes to their mind: extremism, brutality, and deviance. And I hope that we get into that today. But for modern Ibadis, Khawārij as an identity marker concerning their origins is highly disputable. And given the portrayal of Kharijites in Muslim literature, it is completely understandable as to why they have chosen to distance themselves from such a label. But are what we deem to be characteristics of Kharijism based on descriptors found in Islamic literature historically sound, or does the information for what we believe to be the intrinsic hallmark of Kharijite behavior tell us more about the author's intentions rather than the historicity of Kharijism? And are these allegations of Ibadis being from the Kharijites or having a Kharijite origin a gross lie used to slander members of that community? Or is there any truth to such a claim? And that the Ibadi attempt to disentangle themselves from the Kharijites is nothing more than a sleight of hands, to say the least. In this installment of Real Talk with Tehran Pool, we have two special guests here to talk about, on the one hand, the portrayal of Kharijites in the early Islamic historical tradition, and on the other hand, the formation of Ibadi identity. Please welcome professors Dr. Hannah-Lena Hagemann and Dr. Adam Gaiser. Thank you for joining me today on my platform. I greatly appreciate you two for taking the time to speak with me about these two very interesting topics.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Sorry, Adam, for speaking over you, but thanks very much for having us.
Oh, no worries at all. And I'm just going to give a little bit of your background. Professor Hagemann is a historian of early Islam with a particular interest in historiography and historical memory, rebellion and social strife, Islamic late antiquity, the Umayyads, and the history of the Jazira, which is northern Mesopotamia. She received her PhD from Edinburgh University in 2015 for a dissertation on the representation of Kharijites in works, mostly chronicles of the early Islamic historical tradition. She worked with Stefan Hedman, ERC project, the Early Islamic Empire at Work, for Hamburg University for several years, during which she focused on the administrative history and geography of the Jazira. As leader of her own research group, she is thrilled to return to Kharijism, this time for a more positive perspective. Professor Adam Gaiser teaches courses in Islamic studies. His research focuses on the development of early Kharijites and Ibadi, especially on how these groups negotiated their identity in the context of Arabian, Mesopotamian, and North African cultural religious settings. Dr. Gaiser also teaches courses on Shiism, Islam in North America, Islamic law, the Prophet Muhammad, and the Quran. All right. And Ibadi studies is a very niche field of research, with the Kharijites even more so. Therefore, I'm always intrigued by people who happen to study these subjects and interested in knowing how they stumbled across them, including what inclined them to pursue scholarship in that particular field. So, Professor Gaiser, we'll start with you first. How did you stumble across the Ibadis, and what inclined you to research the history of this religious tradition?
We're kind of going back to ancient history. My dissertation was quite a long time ago at this point. So I started looking around for a dissertation topic, and sort of in the late 90s. And I, like Hannah, had this interest in the Khawārij, but it's very difficult to try and pull off a dissertation about the Khawārij because there's not a whole lot of information you have to go on. Hannah was able to pull it off. I couldn't do it. But as I was researching this group, I stumbled across the Ibāḍīs. And again, in the late 90s, there was really not a whole lot of information about the Ibāḍīs, but they had mountains of text, and they were very, very interesting. Here was a group that offered a kind of non-Sunni, non-Shiite perspective on the early period, which I was interested in. So I decided to do a dissertation on the Ibāḍīs. Now, I knew basically nobody at the time. So I went to Jordan. Jordan had this relationship with Oman, and they had a library there, and they had an Omani Studies Center that had a lot of the books that I was looking for. They had a couple of manuscripts. And so that's kind of how I got into it. I was looking to do a dissertation on the Khawārij, and I found the Ibadi, and then that kind of led in its own direction.
And if you don't mind me asking, what was your first what was your dissertation on?
It was the book. It was about the imamate traditions. Yeah, when I looked at the Ibadi, they had this incredibly complex tradition about leadership. I mean, far more complex than sort of Sunni and possibly even Shia, although the Shia tradition is pretty complex too. But they just had this very intricate imamate tradition, and it fascinated me. So I was trying to tie that down to like sort of what kind of intellectual currents might these ideas have come out of, and that was a dissertation. And then, of course, like most dissertations, it becomes your first book.
Interesting. Yeah, I believe I've seen that, the concept of the imamate and the Ibadi tradition. And I actually look forward to reading it, even though it's an older work than the one that I've just read. It still caught my interest nonetheless. Similarly, Professor Hagemann, how did you stumble across the Kharijites, and what inclined you to this research out of all the fields of research within Islamic studies?
I mean, I first came across the Kharijites towards the end of my first degree, which I did here at Hamburg. And so we had a guest lecturer who offered this course on this group that I'd never heard of before, because we hadn't actually covered them at all in our studies up to that point. And so I got very curious and was just fascinated. Actually, similarly, like Adam. I thought, well, so here's a group who seems to be actually quite separate from, you learn about the Sunni and the Shi'i divide, but you, at least in sort of like your standard university survey course, you don't really hear about the Kharijites. If you hear about them at all, then it's usually as some kind of footnote, something that is somehow deviant or aberrant, something that doesn't, really fit. And so it's usually sort of tossed aside. I was fascinated about the group. I wrote a very, very long-term paper on Kharijite theology, and this is sort of how my interest got started. And I then wrote my MA dissertation on Kharijite poetry, which was a challenge, certainly. I would say to this day, probably classical Arabic poetry, probably the the greatest challenge, certainly for me. When I thought about pursuing a PhD, I also originally thought I might want to continue this work and actually write a PhD on Kharijite poetry. But in the sort of like the first 6 months or so of the PhD, once I got into Edinburgh, I actually realized that we don't really know, or I would like to say we didn't really know much about who this group was, how they were portrayed, and how they were understood really in the tradition, beyond the sort of very negative image that you described at the introduction. Because I've also always been very interested in historical writing, so in historiography, I sort of switched course quite a bit, and so decided to stick with the Kharijites, but do historiography. And I'm very happy with that choice. And of course, I came across Adam's first book while I was writing my own dissertation. I highly recommend it. It's a very complex topic indeed, but I think Adam does a fantastic job of making it comprehensible, really. Everyone go read it.
Okay. And, I think we're all here because we're interested more or less in the Ibāḍīs or in the Kharijites. My first introduction to the Ibadi school of thought was via a friend who was writing a blog. And at that time, I identified more or less as Sunni, and I really wasn't trying to hear anything outside of the Sunni context, but he would keep talking to me about it. He was a friend of mine, so I would listen. And then after a while, I kind of was like, well, let me look into this for myself and see what he's on about, because he has so much enthusiasm behind it. And then when I started to look at the history myself, I was actually shocked. As Adam had mentioned, or Professor Gaiser had mentioned, I found that their narrative was different than the Sunni and Shi'i narrative. And that's something that I found very attractive. And then also that for them to be such a small sect, I think constituting less than 1% of the Muslim Ummah, they have a very long history and a very rich tradition. So that's one of the reasons why I became interested in that school. And when it comes to Ibadis, you cannot talk about the Ibadis without talking about the Kharijites, and that's when I became interested in Kharijism. Okay, so let's start with the Kharijites. Based on our previous conversation, that's where Adam had advised that's where we should start. So, which is where I kind of started when I first became interested in the Ibadi tradition on Islamic history. This was mostly due to the fact that when I began to share this interest with other Muslims, I constantly heard from them accusations of how Ibadis are from the Khawārij, a term denoting extremism, brutality, and deviance in the minds of the vast majority of Muslims, as you both may already know. So concerning the Kharijites, I decided to look into the subject myself. This was over a year ago, and unfortunately at the time, not much was available detailing the history of the Kharijites, to my satisfaction anyway. Since then, I have become more familiar with the Kharijite history, but for those watching who might not be as familiar, who are the Kharijites and from where do we first see their emergence onto the scene of Islamic history?
Adam, if you don't mind me jumping in, going first. Excellent. The main sort of narrative has it that the Kharijites emerged in the context of the First Civil War. For those, I assume that everyone is familiar with the fact that there was a First Civil War and a Second Civil War in the first century of Islamic history. And so they were said to have emerged from this conflict, which occurred after the murder of the third rightly guided caliph, so the third successor of the Prophet Muhammad. And so this was about 25 years or so after the death of Muhammad. And so we had a civil war between competing factions of the Islamic elite who were rivals for the caliphate, so rivals for power. And the Kharijites, they were originally the supporters of one faction, so the supporters of who is today acknowledged as the fourth rightly guided caliph, Ali ibn Abi Talib. Basically the sort of the moment where it all starts to go wrong is the Battle of Siffin in 657. And so at this battle, it seemed that Ali at first would be victorious, but then his opponent, who was the founder of the Umayyad Caliphate, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, he suggested a ceasefire, a negotiation, basically a way to settle this outside the battlefield. Ali eventually agreed, probably because he was coerced to agree to this. At least this is how the story goes. And the Kharijites weren't happy with that. It's a very complicated history. The sequence of events isn't entirely clear. The factions within Ali's camp aren't entirely clear. However we got to the stage, once either the arbitration agreement was read out, or once the result of the arbitration was made public, the Kharijites were not amused and basically accused Ali of giving judgment in this whole affair over to God rather than, giving judgment in this affair over to human beings and not to God. So basically they wanted him to continue fighting against his opponents and sort things out on the battlefield. Ali refused, probably because he felt bound by the arbitration agreement, and they separated from him. And one explanation for the name Khawārij, so those who secede or those who go out, is because they physically separated from Ali at this point in the conflict. So now we have three factions. We still have Ali, we still have the faction of Muawiyah, and then we have this faction of the Khawārij, the seceders, who were opposed to both of them. There was some brief reconciliation, but then a second separation, a second Khuruj, and this is the final break between the Kharijites and Ali, for a very sort of general, very brief summary. origin story.
And Adam, was there anything that you would like to say about that?
No, Hannah,
Okay.
Hannah knows this very well.
And you know, because all the events in that early period around the Civil War are not so clear cut, and there isn't really a sequence of events, I find that to be the most fascinating, because it's like, where do you kind of place one event before the other? If you switch it around, maybe you can say this person was responsible for this and that person was responsible for that. But yeah, it's just like putting together a jigsaw puzzle or something. And as I've already mentioned, some time ago when I was looking to find a book with a detailed history on the Kharijites, I could not find anything to my satisfaction. So I was a bit surprised to find my sentiments somewhat confirmed in your book, Professor Hagemann, that research on the Kharijites within academia is sparse. So I'm curious as to why they have why have the Kharijites remained relatively understudied compared to other Muslim groups, in your opinion?
It's a very good question. I'm not very clear on that myself, because I think they're absolutely fascinating. I think one problem has to do with source material. We don't really have any genuinely Kharijite sources, depending on definition of what a Kharijite is, apart from poetry, and that is if you accept the attribution in the sources, because Kharijite poetry is not transmitted separately in Kharijite deviance, for instance, but it's mostly separate. It's mostly transmitted in the same narrative sources that are subject to any number of challenges. And so we don't really have a Kharijite Tariq work, for instance. We don't really have a Kharijite work of history. We don't really have a Kharijite biographical dictionary. I mean, that would be absolutely bloody fantastic. We have some coins that we can probably, reasonably, with reasonable certainty and assume are Kharijite coins, and we have poetry and some sermons and speeches that are attributed to them. But apart from that, source material is very thin on the ground, and because most of them, and quite certainly the militant factions among them, died out relatively quickly, died out before the 9th century, which is when the written tradition really, arrives on the scene in full force. There wasn't really much chance of later Kharijites writing works that would sort of retrospectively give their view of history. This is something where the Ibāḍīs actually come in, but I will leave that part to Adam. But for the Kharijites, I think this lack of source material is one huge obstacle. I think another one has to do with what you already mentioned a couple of times, and that's their reputation. I think that many people sort of shy away from dealing with them because of these very negative labels that are associated with them. I mean, for the modern period, there's a reason why political opponents, for instance, or jihadis are very often termed Kharijites or neo-Kharijites. For various reasons. And of course, these are very diverse actors that are labeled in that way for very diverse reasons. But it sort of underlines how stubborn, as it were, this label has been. And it's actually, even just gotten worse, I think, over time. So this, I think, is another real problem. And then also, they are quite a small group. I mean, as you also mentioned already, Ibadi studies is really starting to kick off, but it is still quite a niche field. Certainly, it's not a niche field compared to Kharijism or compared to Kharijite studies. I'm not even sure you can call that a niche. But I think many people don't really consider them particularly important for the cause of Islamic history and for the development of Islam. There are some people who would disagree, but overall, I think they are usually considered this group of heretics and fanatics who were exceptionally violent and who died out very quickly, and so don't really have much to tell us. So those are my 2 cents, as it were. Yeah, and as I said, personally, I'm yeah, I wish people were less hesitant.
I really like the point you first brought up about how when the Kharijites were in existence, it was before the 9th century or during the 9th century, right before the flourishing of writing took place in the Islamic world. That's something that I didn't consider. I was more so leaning towards the reputation that the Kharijites have is why people tend to shy away from researching their history, and that they're not seen as an authentic Islamic expression. Being that Sunnis make up 85 or 90, I don't even know how they get these numbers, but they make up majority of the Muslim world, that anything outside of Sunni Islam within academia. And I know that was the situation long ago, being that Sunni sources were more available, that Sunni Islam was seen as a more authentic expression of Islam. And so why bother studying maybe Shiism or Ibadism? And see, I asked that question, why they remain understudied, considering the hype behind the search for Islamic origins and its early development, being that the Kharijites were the first faction of Muslims to break away from the wider body of Muslims, as you two already know, and the first to crystallize as a sect, according to Patricia Crone. I would think for those of us who are interested in early Islam, it would be in our best interest to have a history of the Kharijites based on factual information, or as much history on the Kharijites as possible to understand that early period of Islam. But as you mentioned, we don't have much from the Kharijites themselves. It seems like the most authentic source for Kharijism we have are coinage and poetry. But outside of coinage and poetry, what other sources are we dependent on for history of the Kharijites, and who were responsible for its composition?
I don't know, Adam, do you want to start with the Ibāḍīs or?
Yeah, I mean, Ibadi sources are an interesting kind of case because there is some sort of connection to this group that later groups identify as Khawārij. I mean, that's another problem that Hannah has written about quite a bit, is the very term itself is kind of opaque. When the later Sunni tradition is trying to figure out who they are in like sort of the 9th and 10th century, they're, one way human beings do that is they find a group to say who they're not. And the Kharijites get kind of swept up into this. So one is always trying to have to figure out how much of this information are we getting is part of this polemical move to try and identify ourselves in relation to somebody else. So the very term itself is difficult to try and pin down. Ibadi sources have their own concerns, right? Ibadis had their own concerns when they were writing their own history. So Ibadism is and the early Ibadi sources are a wonderful source for information on these groups that kind of we've now decided to collectively call the Khawārij. But yeah, they have their own kind of lenses that you have to kind of filter the information through. I found them very interesting. One thing that I tried to do in the second book was to notice how what later becomes the Sunni tradition seems to have a body of material that it's talking about in a certain kind of way, and the Ibāḍīs have a body of material that they're talking about in a certain way, and it seems to be coming from the same source, in my opinion. There does seem to be some sort of material that they were drawing on, but casting that in their own way. So, I mean, this is some of the work that Hannah has done so wonderfully in her recent book, is to really look at the historiographical question. But this is hard material. You ask, like, why hasn't anybody done this? Because it's bloody hard. I mean, the information is strewn across hundreds of sources, and so you're kind of a scholarly archaeologist, like picking little pottery shards and trying to put them back together, but each pottery shard comes from a different pot. It's really very, very difficult work. And Ibadism is a wonderful source, really, and they have a lot of information. But keep in mind that Ibadis don't consider themselves Khawārij. So, and there's reasons for that, and they're not entirely wrong, right? We're back to the ambiguity of that term Khawārij and what that means, right? So you have to, Ibadism is a great source, but you do have to be very, very aware of the kind of historiographical questions that like of the kind that Hannah brings up in her book. That's Ibadism. I'll defer to you, Hannah, for the rest of the very troubling sources.
Yeah, well, I mean, you basically, other than the Ibadi tradition, which is fascinating, not just because it's a different perspective, but also because it seems to be actually closer to the time that it's describing. So it seems that we actually do have Ibadi sources from the late 8th century. Otherwise, you would use the sort of, what some people call the mainstream sources. So the Proto-Sunni and Proto-Shi'i, and then later Sunni and Shi'i works of history mostly, but also, of course, adab or belettres, literature, biographical dictionaries, geographical literature, which I think is underutilized actually. But also heresiography, and therein lies another problem. So I would say probably the largest amount of information we get on Kharijite groups, so individual groups, and what they may have believed comes from heresiographical literature. So literature that talks about firaq, about sects, for want of a better term. And also from adab literature, so literature that is about edification and entertainment, and beauty, both in a moral and an aesthetic sense, in a way. And so the heresiography is particularly problematic because it's very systematized. It basically sometimes just wholesale invents groups to satisfy the requisite number of sects or of groups that should be there, as it were. And in order to distinguish between all of these groups, sometimes you get incredibly detailed and just incredibly minor differences between so-called groups. But the biggest problem is probably the systematization of the material, and it's often very ahistoric. But this is basically the largest source pool, shall we say, for information on the Kharijites, and on Kharijite groups, and on their doctrines and beliefs. The historical works, it depends a little on what you use. The major chronicles are sometimes quite laconic, so they don't always have a lot to say. Certainly, they don't always have a lot to say about individuals. Local histories, are sometimes a bit more helpful. Biographical dictionaries are tricky because often, especially the notorious Kharijites, usually don't turn up because they're not proper scholars, kind of thing, apart from certain figures that had a special position, like someone that Adam has written about, like Abu Bilal, for instance. I'm sure we'll talk about him
definitely
a bit later, because he's a very, very interesting figure.
Definitely.
Exactly. So these are sort of the standard sources in 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century that you would probably use for getting information about the Kharijites.
And what region are these sources coming from? Are they an assortment just from one region? From where are we getting these sources from? Is some being written in Samarkand, some being written in Yemen, or were they just coming out of one place?
Well, no, they didn't just come from one place, but I would say probably the vast majority, especially for the early history, come from the East, so the Eastern Islamic lands. Iraq, of course, Iran, in a very broad sense, so the East all the way to Khorasan. I think probably that's what the bulk of sources, at least for the early period, comes from. I think Adam is a lot more qualified to talk about the West and Arabia, especially when it comes to the Ibadi sources. But for the mainstream sources, it's a very, very clear Iraqi and generally Eastern focus.
Yeah, that's one thing that I noticed reading your book, that a lot of the chronicles that you drew from were Iraqi sources, and I was just wondering what was the impetus behind that, or why was that so? But then again, a lot of the writing on Muslim history came out of Iraq, so maybe that question is unfounded.
You can look where the paper mills are. That's where the writing's coming out of.
Yeah.
And Baghdad had a major paper mill.
Okay, I didn't know that actually. And sorry. And in my opinion, the Kharijites and early Islamic historical tradition, your book is a huge contribution to understanding the Kharijites for interested readers like myself who are not specialists of any kind, but not entirely ignorant of the subject. But before I disclose too much information, one of the main features in your book that took me by surprise when I first began to read it was your approach to the sources. I expected your book to be a historical construction or reconstruction of the Kharijite history according to what has been written about them from traditional classical Muslim scholarship, but actually it is less about who the Kharijites were in a historical sense and more about who they came to be in Muslim literature. So where did you get the idea to approach the sources like that?
Yeah, sorry, to disappoint anyone, who perhaps had the same impression or the same, hope, as it were. So basically, it grew out of, I would say, the initial 6 to 8 months of my PhD research at Edinburgh. So I started reading up on Kharijite groups of the first 100 years or so, so basically of the Umayyad period, to get a better sense of these people associated with the poetry that I set out to study. And that's when I slowly began to notice that the historical tradition, in a way, is both very diverse, but at the same time also, often does the same thing with the Kharijites, and that it's really difficult to use this kind of material to get a sense of who the Kharijites really were. So the kind of, sort of very, traditional positivist approach, we're writing history as it was, and we're writing about the Kharijites as they were. My impression very quickly was that that's not really possible, or at least it's not possible. It's kind of the second step. The first step is what I then try to do in the book, is to do a historiographical analysis. So to study how the sources talk about the Kharijites. So not just what they say about them, but especially how they say these things. Because basically I was trying to write an overview chapter. That's how it got started. I was trying to write an overview chapter, sort of coming up with exactly this kind of historical introduction to Kharijism that you were looking for a few years back. And I realized that I had all of these accounts from all of these sources, and very often they were either doing something, they were either giving very different details, or basically the impression that I had, and this is, I think, one of the main arguments of the book, is that I didn't get the sense that these were real actors, real historical figures, but that this was, it was basically very static, this impression of Kharijite actors and Kharijite groups that I got. And this is really how I got, how my approach in the book developed, basically out of a sense of, I'm not really sure what to do with this. I'm not sure how to write proper, real history on this basis.
And Adam had mentioned that in an interview I uploaded to my YouTube channel on his book, Ibadi Identities, that, okay, we know that the heresiographical material, the chronicles, they're not telling us Kharijite history as it happened, but what do we do with this material? And I found that to be an excellent segue into your book, because you actually know what to do with this material. And I really enjoyed how you picked it apart. And I really enjoyed the term literary Kharijism. I use that so much in order to distinguish from historical Kharijism that I don't even know, when I use it, people know exactly what I'm talking about. But hopefully after this interview, they will. But literary Kharijism is the term you use throughout your book for how the Kharijites are portrayed in Muslim sources, where you describe this portrayal as standardized and dehistoricized. You also reference Najim Haider and how he suggested that early Islamic historical writing follows a 3-step model. Is that and this is the part I really probably it took me a minute to understand, and I probably still don't understand it all the way, but is the 3-step model mentioned by Haider what you described as reoccurring themes, topoi and schemata found in Muslim sources concerning the Kharijites, or is this three-step model that Nejm Heder mentioned something different than what I had mentioned?
It's different in the sense that it's not procedural in the same way, but what he calls, I think he has like the core, and then he has, I've forgotten the bit in the middle, and then he's got
that explains the core, and
yeah, exactly. And so basically what he considers as the padding of the core in the sources, that is what I call topoi and schemata. So basically, when he presents the different frameworks in the different sources, he basically talks about how they take a core narrative and then develop it in different ways. And you can do that, or one of the ways you can do that is by using certain topoi, so recurring themes and recurring phrases and recurring narratives to make a point about something. And so it's not, when I talk about topoi and schemata and recurring themes and so on, I don't talk about them in the sense of a model or a kind of like procedural mechanism, but more as a kind of observation of these are recurring themes that we can observe the more we read. And really, most of the arguments I make are based on just reading lots and lots and lots and lots of these stories. I think another problem that's prevailed so far is because the Kharijites haven't really been studied in depth. I think often it goes perhaps not unnoticed, but perhaps it's not noticed enough how very similar many of these stories are, and how detached from historical context and how detached from individual circumstances. And this impression, I think, you can only get when you read lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of these stories. At least that's what I would argue.
I was actually thinking that as I was reading the book. I mean, before reading the book, I could have never imagined that Kharijism in Muslim literature was so standardized. But after reading your book, it's like impossible for me to unsee it. And as you mentioned, it gives them no personality. When people argue against them, they don't respond. They don't have any names, and then the ones that do have names, they just pop up everywhere, like Nafi bin al-Azraq. I don't know when he was born and when he died, but it seems like he's everywhere from Safin to 100 years after that. So, three interconnected recurring themes on Kharijism in early Islamic historical writings. One of them is Kharijite piety and its ramifications. Two, longing for jihad and martyrdom. The third one will be indiscriminate killers and transgressors of the very same Islamic norms they claim to defend. Is that pretty much the standardized description of Kharijism in the Islamic historical tradition? I know that maybe some things might differ. They might put them in different situations, but those are three things that you expect to see concerning the Kharijites: piety, as ramifications, jihad, martyrdom, and indiscriminate killing and going against their own principles.
For the militant faction, yes, there are non-militant factions of Kharijites, and I think I will leave that bit to Adam. But for the militant factions, I would expect those ingredients or those characteristics to be there most of the time, not all of the time, and not for every group or for every actor. But most of the time, this is what you see, and this also creates this impression of sameness. And I have a few examples in the book where I just give just quotes from Kharijites, and they all sound very much the same. But then, if you look at the actual context, they are across a range of 100, 150 years, and it's basically just all unchanging. And you could argue, I guess, that they're unchanging because they're a united movement, with very clearly defined principles and very clearly defined beliefs. I think from within my own epistemological framework, I find that very unlikely, not least because of the immense changes in in a socio-political and in economic and military and cultural and so on sense that occurred over the first 150 years of Islam. I mean, really, you can't really compare a mid-7th century Arabian context or Iraqi context with a late or mid or late 8th century Arabian or Iraqi context. Not to mention other regions. Yeah.
And the Kharijites in the Islamic historical tradition, they were used as actors in order to contrast other figures. What's that about? If they're not used in order, if the Kharijites in the historical tradition is not used in order to demonstrate Kharijite history, how are they used to contrast other people in order to cast them in a different light or to make a point?
Yeah, I mean, I should probably say at the outset that when I say literary Kharijism, I make this distinction specifically because it's not my intention to say that the Kharijites didn't exist or that it's all made up, but rather in the sense of before we look at historical Kharijism, I think we need to look at literary Kharijism first. So that's really kind of the frame of the book. And so what I think happens with literary Kharijism in the sense of how are these figures who had a basis in historical reality, but how are they used in narratives that talk about this reality? And as you mentioned, I think one of the ways in which they're used, and which probably also explains why we have this very static and very collective sort of idea of them, and this impression of monotony and homogeneity, is that they kind of don't really need to talk. It's quite well known. I mean, at a relatively early stage, certain characteristics must have been associated with them. And so when they turn up, certainly in the 9th and the 10th century, and in the written sources that we have, people kind of know what to expect. And they do expect them to act in certain ways. And so if you want to illustrate, for instance, that a cause is worthy or is righteous, a pretty easy way of doing that is to basically have it opposed by Kharijites. That doesn't work in all contexts, but it works in a good number of contexts. And I think this is particularly prevalent in the narratives that deal with their confrontation with Ali, which has to do with the figure. So a lot of the time, the portrayal of Kharijites has to do with their enemies, with their opponents. So who they're sort of pitted against. And in the case of Ali, who attained an incredibly important position within the Islamic tradition, who was a very beloved figure in the Islamic tradition, not just among Shiites, but certainly also among Sunnis. There they are basically, I think that is the period where they are the most silent. So you have sometimes incredibly intricate debates, but these debates are basically monologues, because you have people like Ali or Ibn Abbas, his cousin and his envoy to them, basically go through these incredibly intricate dialectical arguments, but you only hear Ali, you only hear Ibn Abbas, and so in that sense, so the Kharijites they're reduced to saying, basically yes, or sometimes they're not even allowed to say yes. It's just sort of they nod or something like that.
I know, because sometimes reading the dialogue, especially between Ali and the Kharijites, after Ali, I'm expecting the Kharijites to say something back, but they never do.
No, they don't.
And that's why I kind of
in the Ibadi tradition, that's flipped.
Yes. And isn't that that is fascinating? Yeah,
I've read it, and that's one of the reasons why I find the Ibadi tradition a little bit more believable, because I see the dialogue going back and forth, especially when Ali goes to Narawan, and they're kind of getting into why they did what they did. But just to go back to what I was going to say, it seems like Ali or the Kharijites were used to contrast Ali, or Ali was used to contrast the Kharijites as a way of vindicating Ali. So in my opinion, it seems like that's why Ali was given such long monologues and used in order to save face, because quite a few suspicious things happened during the caliphate of Ali that could possibly throw a bit of shade onto his leadership, such as the Battle of Narawan. Some people could say that was unmitigated slaughter, but that's just a matter of opinion depending on what sources you read. But I really liked how the Kharijites were contrasted against the Umayyad governors. And what was the intention behind that? Because that was written in the Abbasid period, and in this, the Kharijites weren't used. The Kharijites weren't put in such a negative light. But I wonder what was the intention, because it seemed like they were used as a symptom for, I would maybe, bad governorship, because it doesn't seem like the governors, the Umayyad governors, which were mostly in Iraq, were wholesome people.
That's a really nice way of putting it.
Very generous, Darren.
Yes. I think again, it depends a little bit on who we're talking, because when they are pitted against Al-Muhallab, for instance, so there's this hero of the tribe of Azd, this very well-known general and commander. There they do have a very negative image that has also to do with the fact that he was mostly fighting against the Azarika, who are considered the most violent and the most obnoxious of the Kharijite sub-factions. But yes, when it comes to when it comes to other figures, and perhaps most prominently Al-Hajjaj, the viceroy of the East, the governor of Iraq, Iran, and some other provinces, there I think. And this is very interesting. The image is a lot more nuanced, and you see this not just with Al-Hajjaj, but also with other prominent Umayyad figures. And here it seems it's a bit difficult, because that part, as it were, of the book, that chapter is based mostly on two sources, on Tabari and Baladhuri, and that has to do with the fact that the other sources don't really preserve the narrative content that you need to do this kind of analysis. So if they talk about the Matol in this period, which is the Caliphate of Muawiyah, and then after the Second Civil War, they often just mention perhaps a name or a date or an event or something. So for the Caliphate of Muawiyah, that chapter is based just on Tabari and Baladhuri. And so, we have to be a bit careful with, with being too general about our assumptions. But there it's very clear, and especially with Baladhuri. Baladhuri has no problem letting them appear as, sort of righteous, maybe not righteous, but as, as well-meaning fighters against Umayyad corruption. And that, I think, has to do with the fact that the Umayyads were often, not always, but very often portrayed in a very bad light by Abbasid era writers. And of course, Baladhuri himself was a boon companion of an Abbasid caliph. So that might have also had something to do with it. Tabari is a lot more careful. We have this idea of Tabari as kind of quite austere religious scholars. And
he seems very conservative.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that that translates into his material.
It seems like he wanted to like the Kharijites in his chronicle, but because of his strong sense of order, or his wanting to have order, he was a jurist. So I could see why he wanted to kind of keep things within the bounds of law. In my opinion, it seems like he kind of wanted to. Maybe you guys might think differently, but it seems like he wanted to like the Kharijites, but because of what they represented and all of what came along with them, he still kept them at a distance. But I could be wrong. That's just my interpretation of how I read it.
Liking them is perhaps a bit too strong.
Okay.
I think that he and many other scholars faced a dilemma. What do you do if you have two sides who are equally in the wrong? What do you do with two sides who both have some qualities to redeem them, but overall are morally problematic? How do you portray them when they face off with each other? That's quite. I think one way in which you could solve this problem, and I think this is more prominent in some sources than in others, is to basically, even in the Umayyad period, have the Kharijites be opposed, for instance, by Alids or by proto-Shi'is or by people who are sympathetic to the Alid cause. So there are several instances where people like official Umayyad governors, for instance, specifically send the Shia to fight the Kharijites because they are so hostile to them, and so in that sense, again, perhaps especially in the period of Muawiyah, connecting back to Ali, you do have a faction who seems to be, at least to have a better standing than the Umayyad governors. So that would be one sort of mechanism, whether that is historical or historiographical or both. I think might be subject to debate, but I think it's a very neat historiographical tactic or mechanism.
But there is some. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
I was just going to say, when I read Tabari, I'm always struck by this anxiety that he seems to have that the Kharijites appear to be doing things that are legitimately Islamic, and like they read the Quran, they are arguing for a Quranic, so this anxiety that they appear to be pious. And one of the way that Tabari and others, I think, try and deal with this is to show that there's too much piety, right? They've taken piety beyond its proper limit. They've gone too far. And there's a famous hadith about leaving religion like an arrow leaves a bow.
I think my favorite. Exactly. I think that's my favorite. They will recite the Quran, but their faith will not go beyond their throats, which I think is a beautiful image, a really, really good description of hypocrisy. Yeah.
Which leads to another thing. They try to downplay in the literature. They try to downplay this piety by saying that okay, they might be doing this. It looks pious, but they have evil intentions behind it. Yeah. So even with this piety, I noticed that in the literature, they're still trying to throw shade on it by making it's not. It's not what you really think it is, or hadiths that you'll hear them recite, or you'll think their prayers are better than your prayers, but they're not really. So I definitely see that through the in the literature. And I also wanted to ask, what when they were contrasting the Kharijites to Ibn Abbas, what was the intention? What did you see was the intention behind that? Because you touched on it, but then, or you did more than touch on it, but I didn't seem to follow what the intention was behind Ibn Abbas communication, or contrasting Ibn Abbas with the Khawārij.
I think the point is not necessarily about Ibn Abbas and the Khawārij. I think the point is, or at least not just about that. I think the main point is about Ibn Abbas and Ali, in fact. Because of course, Alids and Abbasids don't have, the most harmonious history and relationship, depending on period and source and,
the Abbasids pretty much used the Alids to
so it would seem, I mean, we're still, in a very early, quite murky period, and Abbasid, history and especially pre-takeover is really hard to reconstruct. But I think, at least this is my reading, I think the point here is about Ibn Abbas and Ali, and I think it's about Ibn Abbas and Ali being shown to work very closely together, and to basically be working towards the same aim. And Ibn Abbas is, especially in At-Tabari's narrative, a very faithful representative of Ali. He's, someone who's basically like an extension of Ali's authority. I think that there's a lot that can be said about this, about the portrayal of the relationship between Ali and Ibn Abbas, and then how it reflects on later Alid-Abbasid relations, the question of authority. Ali basically sort of giving authority to Ibn Abbas as his deputy kind of thing. There's a really nice episode, which I also talk about in the book in At-Tabari, where Ibn Abbas is so eager to defend Ali to the Kharijites that he starts debating with them, even though Ali had told him specifically not to, but to wait. And so Ibn Abbas, sort of starts early because he's so eager, and then of course it goes wrong, and he loses the debate, as it were. And then Ali comes in and saves the day, and then he rebukes Ibn Abbas, but very, very mildly. And it's made clear that Ibn Abbas only disobeyed him because he was so, enthusiastic about defending Ali. And I think if we leave aside the Kharijites for the moment, I think that episode alone, has a lot of meaning and a lot of different meanings, actually, for all of these later questions of how do the Alids and the Abbasids relate to one another.
And in the Ibadi tradition, Ibn Abbas is very important. Actually, he's an important figure to the Ibadis. They call him Bahr al-Ilm, right? Like the sea of knowledge. Yeah. And in the Ibadi tradition of that debate, Ibn Abbas goes and is convinced by the Kharijites and then breaks with Ali.
Yeah.
So like it's a very different kind of narrative. It's pretty incredible how contrasting these things can get.
Yeah. That's why I had asked someone else. Is there any history, anybody else's history, or the history of any religion that has so many competing narratives? I swear you'll find this right here happened, and then you look at another Islamic source and it totally contradicts that, saying things went the opposite way. I'm just curious, is there any other history with so many competing narratives? Because all right, so moving forward, what are some of the challenges now that you have your book out on the historiography of the Kharijites, and you pretty much unpacked how they were used in Islamic literature, the fact that they've been standardized, dehistoricized, they don't have any voice, no personality. How do we move forward in ascertaining, and maybe positivist Kharijite positivist might not be the right word, but how do we ascertain as factual as possible Kharijite history?
With difficulty. With great difficulty. The research project that I lead at the moment, so my own sub-project is on historical Kharijism. So I've done the literary part, I've done the historiographical part, and now I have to get down to the historical part, so to the more positivistic approach, as it were. And I think there are, the challenges remain. That is clear, and you can't do history without doing historiography. That goes for every kind of history, and I think it goes in particular for history of such an early period and with such a problematic source base. But I think there are some ways in which we can circumvent at least some of these problems. And so one, for instance, would be to focus a lot more on material culture, so to actually use the coins, for instance, properly. In trying to maybe not reconstruct, but in trying to basically build up an image of historical Kharijism. Another, I think, is to work prosopographically, so to look at the people involved, the people who are mentioned, to look at their, especially their tribal affiliations, to look at their family networks, to look at regional distribution. So where do we find these people? Can we connect clusters of Kharijite rebellions in one period in one region to certain events? How do we tie it back into the history, of the caliphate proper at the time? How do we explain regional clusters? How do we explain that, for instance, Kharijite groups seem to be mostly composed of northern Arab tribes, and within northern Arab tribes, it's specifically certain clans or certain sub-tribes of Bakr. I think that is something that hasn't been explored properly. So about 120 years ago, I think Julius Wellhausen started us off. I mean, he had a few comments in his major work on some tribal affiliations of some Kharijite leaders. And then much more recently, John Wilkinson, I think, is the one who's really pushed this a lot further. And Adam, of course, can talk a lot more about this, especially as it pertains to Ibadis. But there seems to be a kind of divide as well between Ibadis and Kharijis that roughly maps onto southern and northern other Arab tribes. So that's another thing to investigate. But I think especially the prosopographical work is going to be key. So who are these people? Who are they talking to? Who do they meet? Who are their families? Who are their supporters? Where do they turn up? It certainly isn't coincidence that we find them a lot in the East, in Iran, often in Iraq, in very remote areas. So what's the role of the environment? I think all of these are avenues of research that haven't been explored mostly or at all when it comes to Kharijism. And then, of course, we are now very happily able to use digital tools as well that, for instance, help us to search for certain terms, for instance, much more quickly than we used to be able to. So we can look for people much more quickly in a much larger corpus of sources. So I think that will also give us a definite advantage over previous studies, because of course it's very different. If you type in a name into a search tool, and then it takes about 2 seconds to search 6,000 works of the tradition, that is very different from having to manually comb through indices and
Yeah, I was going to comment about that because before a friend of mine showed me a database of hadith where you can just type in a single word and it'll give you all the hadith related to that. I was under the impression that scholars such as you two are sitting at a table, 100 books out, trying to with
Not wrong.
magnifying glasses, trying to find this narration compared with this one. But yeah, I'm starting to find out that there's databases where you can just type in a word and it'll bring up everything that's ever been written on it. Sometimes you still have to check it with the written source, but it's been very helpful. Hopefully these type of things start coming out to the average person, but I doubt it. I don't think that'll happen anytime soon.
Well, right. I mean, maybe, yeah. I mean, a lot of this is actually just freely available online. You just need to know, where to find it, basically.
Okay, I think that's the key.
But yeah,
if I didn't have a friend who's studying in Islam or who's taking courses on Islamic studies, I probably would have never known about it.
Yeah.
But okay, now from Mahakama to al-Sharat. Or I guess we're still with the Kharijites. Some people call the Mahakama the first Kharijites. I know Ibāḍīs, they do not see the Mahakama as being the Kharijites, which I read something from Abdul Rahman al-Salami, which kind of made sense that the Azaraka and the Najdiya, they wanted to go out and fight. So that's why they were called the Khawārij, while the Ibāḍīya, they wanted to just sit back, not want to fight. So in that sense, Abdul Rahman al-Salami argues that the Azaraka, Najdiya are Khawārij, while the Ibāḍīs are sitting back. But I'm interested in before we even get to the Ibadi, the Mahakama, how we know that they emerged as Safin with the slogan Lahukum Ilallah, if I said that right. Starting with Abu Bilal's brother, they say. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Urwa bin Uday. It started with him. But when do they become al-Sharat? I mean, and did they identify as the Mahakama in that period when they separated themselves from Ali's army, or was this a later term given to them by historians, chroniclers, heresiographers? Because I noticed in your book, Sharat Ibadi Identities, that I get the feeling that classical Muslim scholars did use Mahakama as an identifier for this group.
Yeah, those are tough questions, Taryn, and I'd reemphasize one of the things that Hannah was emphasizing is that, when we look at the history of the groups that we're looking at, we have to remember that it's written in a context to a particular audience and both the author and the audience have certain expectations and concerns that they're trying to work out in the writing of history. Right. So, and that's the same with Ibāḍīs and Ibadi sources. We have a real mountain of Ibadi sources in comparison to what we have from the groups that later get identified as Kharijites. But the principle is the same. So did the Muhakkima call themselves the Muhakkima? That's a real hard question to answer, because again, you're relying on sources that are written in a particular time period to people that have their own interest in defining certain groups certain ways. The Ibāḍīs do seem from an early period to be, some of them willing to use the term Khawārij in a positive fashion and to sort of own that term. And that goes up to the present day too. You can find Ibadi sources where they'll say, yeah, we're the Khawārij. That's not the way that most Ibāḍīs would approach that. Most of them would make the distinction that Abdul Rahman makes, where to say, there's this group of the Muhakkima Shurat, and then there's this other group called the Khawārij, and those are these militant groups like the Azarika. And that, again, that distinction goes way back too. So answering that, when did the term Muhakkima come into play? Sometime early, clearly, but we don't have a clear sense of sort of why that became a useful term necessarily. Ibadi certainly use it. And it does have something to do with this phrase. So maybe that was just a convenient shorthand. I don't know. Shurat is an interesting term because, there's a couple of Quranic verses that talk about exchanging one's life for God's pleasure, essentially, right? And it seems to be an early way to talk about martyrdom. Essentially, that's, if you're a martyr, that's kind of what you're doing. You're exchanging your life for the greater pleasure of God. And that could be dying for justice or, whatever that means. And again, Hannah has talked about the problematic nature of poetry, in that the poetry is ensconced in the same kind of sources that have the same sort of issues that we're talking about. But it does seem that Shurat turns up pretty early, and a lot more frequently than the term Kharijite does, actually. And Ibāḍīs definitely will talk about the Muhakkima as Shurat, as people who are willing to exchange themselves, or being willing to exchange themselves. So it does seem to be this early term that people were willing to use to describe this early group. And Shurat's maybe a more general term, because the Shurat are the Muhakkima and then other people who follow after them. It's this kind of general term that Ibāḍīs use. And then in Ibādism, that term has a life of its own that we could talk about a little bit later. But broadly speaking, what's always interested me about the way that Ibāḍīs write about these early groups is that they seem to be doing something that people in late antiquity did, which is they are creating a community, creating a kind of communal identity around a group of martyrs, right? This is something that early Christians did. A lot of early Christian identity and activity happened around the memory of the martyrs. And you can find this in, even Manichaeans were doing this. You have all sorts of so-called Gnostic groups that were doing this, right? This is a fairly common move. And thinking of martyrdom too as sort of bleeding into asceticism, right?
That's exactly what I was going to ask. Did this concept, or did al-Shurat from the concept of Shira, which was, if I'm saying that correctly, Shira? Shira. That was pulled from the wider Near East or wider Middle East. It wasn't something that Muhakkima or what people who they called the Muhakkima, it's not something that they created for themselves.
It's a Quranic term, but it sits in the context of late antiquity. And in the context of late antiquity, you have a lot of people thinking about martyrs and talking about martyrs and remembering martyrs. So you can think of it as a kind of a variation, a Quranic variant, a Quranic sort of commentary on this wider group of, or this wider conversation of martyrdom, right?
It's definitely a shared milieu, just if I may jump in here as well. And I think that also actually contributes to this sense of, so what is actually specific about the Kharijites? Because, for instance, the way that their militant piety is described is, of course, also exactly the same way in which the militant piety, for instance, of the early conquerors of the companions of the Prophet is described, or the way that the militant piety of the Ghazis, the frontier warriors, is described. You know, or a lot of these notions of this, you know, this material world is transient and fleeting, and we should really focus on the hereafter, and we should not, you know, we should not be deterred from this by fear of death. Because this life is borrowed anyway. I mean, that you find exactly the same sentiments that you find in Kharijite poetry, for instance, you find in aesthetic poetry of the early Muslim period and Zuhd poetry. And of course, again, you find exactly the same images and exactly the same ideas. For instance, in early Christian martyrdom literature, you know, and this actually was one of the things I found most fascinating, Adam, about your second book. Is just, I think it just does such a fantastic job of showing how widespread these notions were, and that really you can't draw any clear boundaries between individual communities regarding these narratives and also these practices.
And it wasn't just simply borrowing, but that there was a pool that everybody was pulling from.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about shared worlds, right? I mean, you know, Christians, Jews, and Muslims are not separate from one another in hermetically sealed bubbles. I mean, they're living right on top of each other. And also just the way that, you know, living in the modern world means that myself in Florida, you in England, and Hannah in Germany, you know, we have a set of shared assumptions about, more or less, about, you know, how the world works and about, you know, what certain things mean and how we operate in this world. And I imagine we've probably all read some of the same books and watched some of the same movies, and, you know, we're familiar with some of the same genres. I like the Western genre because that's a genre that migrates really fantastically. And I also just like Westerns too.
Explains why you mentioned if the
would.
Khawārij were to put together a spaghetti Western, they would, because, you know, I've heard you use that a few times. So
yeah, Sergio Leone like makes Westerns in Italy in the 60s, and they're brilliant. I mean, it absolutely changes the genre, but it's still a recognizable genre, right?
Yeah.
and that's actually what I really like how you described Ibadi identity as a cumulative tradition, or an avalanche. I think is the best way that you described it. As an avalanche starts off probably this big, and as it goes down, it picks up more and more stuff, but it's still that at the end of it, it's still that same avalanche that started in the beginning, just picked up a lot more stuff in the process. So I'm curious, did
Well, and it's
this
also got the same stuff that it started at the top with,
true.
right?
It didn't lose anything. So,
No,
or
it didn't
maybe it
lose
lost.
anything. It's all kind of fallen down the mountain in the same way.
So I'm curious, did this concept of Shira inform Kharijite and embodied poetry? Or
Yeah, it's all over the place in Ibadi poetry and in so-called Khariji's poetry. I have to like put so-called in front of that term now because of Hannah's work. I'm just not convinced that we know what we're talking about anymore.
So I
Sorry.
guess what I'm trying to ask are these
No, I appreciate the intervention.
I guess what I'm trying to ask is the concept of Shura something that was a part of the Muslim community from its inception, or was it something that it adopted later on down the line?
That's hard to say if it's part of the wider Muslim community. It's definitely something that survives within sort of the Ibadi and Kharijī spheres. I'm not sure what kind of life it had outside of that, if any. It's hard to say. You know, this term Shaheed Shuhada in the Quran is David Cook has this very interesting, I think it's David Cook has this very interesting article about how that might not necessarily refer directly to martyrdom. And so it's interesting to think if that didn't refer to martyrdom, what did? And I think Shirat would be a good candidate for sort of, from a Quranic perspective, what did refer to martyrdom. Now, at some point, of course, Muslims decided these verses on Shaheed Shuhada does in fact refer to this concept of martyrdom. But it's interesting to imagine if David Cook is onto something, what then might have filled the gap earlier, because clearly Muslims had an idea of martyrdom.
I mean, I'm not sure about the concept as such, but you certainly see the verse itself being used, for instance, before battle to exhort people, before the fighting starts. And you find that in diverse contexts, contexts that have absolutely nothing to do at all with Kharijis or with Ibāḍīs. And of course, it's Quranic, so it's used by everyone. I mean, that goes for every Quranic concept, for every Quranic verse. It's kind of, open for use, as it were, for everyone who wants to resort to the Quran.
And I would like to ask about Abu Bilal Mirdas bin Uday. Died 681. Yeah, he's my favorite too. And then the Ibadis have taken a lot of inspiration from him. But I'm just wondering, how do they make that connection? It seems like he's just very distant. Although he died 681, the Kharijites split, if you go with the tradition, happened 684. So he was still in line. How are the Ibadis connected to him? I really kind of don't see the link per se. Even though I believe there are traditions where Ibadis have Jabir bin Zayd with Abu Bilal talking to Aisha, but I'm still curious on how they taken his personality and appropriated to their identity.
Well, I think, in the same way that I'm connected to George Washington, Ibadis are connected to Abu Bilal, right? I mean, when we imagine ourselves as part of a community, and I don't mean imagine like making stuff up, I mean, imagine in the more sort of substantive way, right? We're all part of communities that we didn't choose to be part of, right? We were just born into these places, and we inherit notions about the groups that we belong to. And, you can think of maybe concentric circles of groups that you can belong to, starting with your immediate family and then going outward in a way that makes sense to you. Those things have to be created. You're not born as a child knowing that, oh, I'm an American. That's not something that you arrive in this world knowing, right? You have to come to understand that in certain ways. And I think Ibadis did the same thing that everybody in the ancient world did. They created the communities around certain groups of people that happened to be martyrs. And Abu Bilal was a very good example, right? At least the way that he's portrayed in the Ibadi tradition, and even outside of the Ibadi tradition, as somebody who showed great restraint, right? And this was something the Ibadis were and are very interested in. They wanted to make a distinction between themselves and these other types of Kharijites, the Azarika and the Najdat, who, by all accounts, were really quite militant and willing to fight and willing to accuse other Muslims of even not being Muslims, of even being polytheist, right? So Abu Bilal offers an interesting figure around whom you can rally, because he, on the one hand, is fighting against the hated Umayyads, but on the other hand, shows great restraint in his rebellion. And so, if I'm the Ibadis and I'm in Basra in the 8th century and I'm looking back at the history of who I think I am, I can imagine, and I don't mean made up by imagine, I mean in a more substantive way, you connect yourself to these groups of figures, and that becomes who you are. That becomes part of your identity. In the way that I have absolutely no connection physically to George Washington, and yet I imagine myself as part of the community that he founded. And in fact, I am a part of the community that he founded. I got a passport to prove it. You see what I mean?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that was a really good explanation, because I do see George, when I'm living in England, people ask me about the United States, and I say my founding fathers, our founding fathers. I clearly have no familiar relations with George Washington. We don't come from the same trajectory, but yet I feel like I'm a part of the country he founded and see him as one of my founding fathers. I actually never really thought about it like that, because I was ready to say the Ibadis were stealing figures and appropriating them to themselves, but the way that you explained it, it's not so simplistic like that. I mean, and you gave the example of us being American, and how our founding fathers pretty much have nothing to do with us, but we still see them as being a part of our identity. And
even despite the other, I mean, my family came from Germany in the 1860s, so like actually I have more in common with Hannah if you want to get down to it. And yet, because I grew up in this country, You know, I am an American. But yeah, this is, you know, these are how sort of scholars are thinking about the ways that communities form and how they create that sense of community. And Ibāḍīs just simply do the same thing. Now, what is interesting is that they, you know, Hannah alluded to the fact that there's these different sort of tribal groupings that seem to be going on in the mix. Is that the people that we now identify as Kharijites do seem, for the most part, to come from kind of northern tribal groups, and Ibāḍīs, when they start proselytizing, really proselytize among southern groups. And you know, tribe, so-called tribe, is an important identity marker in the late antique you know, world that we're talking about. And so these connections to these groups did have to be, you know, made in a particular way that did not include tribal connections. It included you know, different kind of ways of thinking about who we are and how we align ourselves. What's also interesting about Abu Bilal, there seems to be some indication that he was such a well-known figure that even some Shiites apparently
I was going to ask that.
even Mu'tazilites tried to appropriate him. There's this tantalizing little line, and I think it's in Mubarak, where he says this. Of course, we know nothing else about that, but there is this little teaser that apparently he had a pretty wide sphere of influence there outside of, and
You know,
other so-called Kharijī groups too, the Sufriya, whoever they were, trying to appropriate him, and yeah, so maybe that gives some sense, Taryn, about the sort of the trajectory and the memory of Abu Bilal.
I did want to ask you a question about the Ibad of Al-Hira, because it seems like you touched on something about how people were trying to fashion a community that transcends tribal boundaries. And you talked about the Ibad of Al-Hira. I find that name to be very interesting, Ibad, and then, you know, it's a book on Ibāḍīs, even though they really don't have, from what I can tell, much to do with each other, except that I noticed that within the body school of thought, there is an idea of transcending tribal affiliations, and that religious identity should supersede. I wonder, is there any way that that came from the Al-Ibad of Hira, or were they just like an anomaly in their time?
If you ask me, I think that's just a sort of happy coincidence. I don't really think there's much connection. One of the problems is it's not entirely clear when Ibāḍīs begin to call themselves Ibāḍīs. So it's not entirely clear that the fact that there's a group in Al-Hira that calls themselves the Ibād would have meant anything to early people who later we identify as Ibāḍīs, right? Yeah, it's not entirely clear when Ibāḍīs begin to own that title. I mean, by the 9th century for sure, but before then, we don't really know how much about how that term comes about. And Ibn Hazm talks about Ibāḍīs in Spain not knowing who Ibn Ibad even is.
Yeah, that's definitely a figure that I have many questions about, but especially after reading that article by Wilfred Madelung, that just, I mean, if reading the epistle of Selim ibn Dakwan by Patricia Crone and Zimmerman didn't kind of just blow my mind with what they said about Ibn Ibad, that Wilfred Madelung paper surely did. But I did want to ask you about boundary making, because this right here is something that I found to be one of the most interesting. You touched on it in your book, but I really like your article, Takfir Reexamined, is that the idea of calling someone a kafir or attributing kufr to someone wasn't as defined as it is today. And that there's a possibility that even when it was employed or used against Ali by the Muhakama, as they're so called, there wasn't really a clear-cut definition or what's exactly meant by that. If you don't mind touching on that.
Yeah, I mean, you've summarized it quite well there. I think one of the dangers of doing history is that you kind of import the anachronisms of your time back onto the group that you're studying, and so one of the jobs of a historian is to try and unimagine yourself back to perhaps what could have been a series of possibilities for people. And basically, you know, if you imagine yourself in the early Islamic world, just like the early Christian world, it took a long time for Christians to work out what Christianity meant, and they argued about it for, well, they're still arguing about it.
I would contend that they still haven't quite worked it out.
They're still kind of figuring that out. And why should we expect Muslims to be any different, right? So in the early period of the Islamic Empire, there's all these questions about what it means to be a Muslim, and you have the Quran and you have the memory of the Prophet Muhammad, certainly as kind of guiding stars, but again, it's not entirely clear that people knew exactly what the term kufr meant. It's if you look at it from a Quranic perspective, it's a very complex term, and it has a lot of different valences. It's interesting to us, of course, because this is a thing that's associated with the Khawārij pretty strongly, and it is something that the Ibāḍīs have a very interesting take on, also, right? Like
Definitely.
modern Ibāḍīs do have this very interesting way of thinking about who is and who is not a pious Muslim, right? And if you're committing polytheism, that's pretty clear that you're outside of the fold. But what if you're someone who professes monotheism, but you're not an Ibadi, right? We'll say that for the Ibadis, they would say that's a kind of ingratitude, which is one of the meanings of kufr. That's a kind of ingratitude, but it's sort of a lesser ingratitude. It's certainly lesser than committing shirk, right? Than committing idolatry. And so that's a way that Ibadis have incorporated kind of monotheists into the way that they conceptualize themselves in relation to other Muslims, into this boundary making that you're talking about, Taryn.
In your book, I read that Sam bin Ghalib was the first to label people of the Qibla with kufr, or the first to dichotomize between kufr and iman.
So the sources say, right?
So the sources say.
When I was writing that part, the point I was trying to make is that it's not really clear when all of this develops, right? Supposedly this guy was, sources say that this guy, we don't know.
But if just going by this tradition, I don't believe this is exactly how it happened. In your book, you mentioned that when the Khawārij split, when the Azarika, Sufri, Najdi, Ibāḍīs, when they split, it wasn't like it just happened in 1 year, but it took over several decades for these boundaries to define themselves. But just from that tradition, I noticed that there is an argument between how to define Muslims, where the Azarika define people not a part of the group one way. The Ibadi say, no, you're wrong. Then they define people not a part of the group one way, and the Sufri say, no, you're wrong. And it seems like that encapsulates, even though that tradition might not be historically sound, it seems like it does encapsulate or represent a shift where these boundaries became more defined or clearly defined. But to see how do I want to say this, but it seems like I mean, and again, introducing that tradition, because let's just touch on Ibn Ibad. Ibn Ibad seems, from that Wilfred Madelung paper, seemed to have been a later figure. And it makes me wonder, where did this idea of kufr ni'ma come from? Because in his paper, he mentioned that Jabir bin Zayd and his student who came after him, Abu Ubaidah, did not use that term to refer to other Muslims, but they just considered them as hypocrites. And it seems like a lot of what is associated with kufr ni'ma is linked to Ibn Ibad. Now, I read in Wilfred Madelung's paper that Ibn Ibad, and also in your book, that Ibn Ibad might not have been a contemporary of Jabir bin Zayd, but a contemporary of Abu Ubaidah, and that he might not have been within the same circle of Abu Ubaidah, but was a rival, was part of a rival group. So I'm just trying to figure out, how do I make sense of all of that? Because in one sense, I want to say that you can make the argument, and some people do make the argument, that Jabir bin Zayd was not an Ibadi, being that when you look at his writings, I believe there are some early writings of his, he doesn't identify as such. He doesn't use the language that Ibadis later would use, and nor do you see this in his nor do you see this from his student Abu Ubaidah. But here comes along Abdullah ibn Abad, and now we see this terminology being used, kufr nama, and now these people are identified as Ibadīs. I read in your book that might be because the Abbasid caliph who was familiar with Abdullah ibn Abad may have labeled him that. But I wonder if there was like a conflation of groups later on down the road that, just like groups of Muslims were appropriating figures, Abu Bilal, certain Muhakkama figures and such. Um, did that possibly happen with Jabir bin Zayd, Abu Ubaidah, by a group that maybe was associated with Abdullah ibn Abad? Maybe what I said is and hopefully you can make sense out of everything I said, but just reading that article again, it just totally complicated things for me and how I understood Ibadi history to kind of go from Jabir bin Zayd to Abdullah ibn Abad, or really, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm confusing myself, but
I think maybe one way to get at some of the issues you're talking about, Taryn, is to notice that there's sort of two. I mean, there's more than two, but let's simplify it. Let's say there's two ways of looking at Ibadi narratives of origin. Okay, and the best place to start is maybe with how Ibadis would narrate their origin, right? And from an Ibadi perspective, you have, God revealing religion to the Prophet Muhammad, passing the religion to the first two righteous caliphs, right? Then Uthman sort of goes astray, and the people of righteousness have to kind of put him back in his place. He won't do it, so he gets killed, right? Then there's a civil war. They ally with Ali. Ali, again, does not fulfill the sort of conditions of piety and righteousness, so they have to break from him. They have to establish their own leader, but Ali comes and he basically slaughters the entire group, right? And so you have these remnants that survive through the Umayyad period, fighting against the Umayyads when they can, mostly in Kufa and Basra. And in Basra, eventually you get this guy named Jabir bin Zayd, right? And he has a group of students that he's collected around him, one of whom is Ibn Ibad, others of whom are Abu Ubaidah, and there's others, right? And they sort of keep that initial message going. And this group somehow eventually becomes known as the Ibāḍīs. Now they call themselves, al-Muslimin. They call themselves the people of righteousness, Ahl al-Istiqamah. And Abu Ubaidah, founds the imamate in Oman, and he sets up the treasury, and he sets up the missionary apparatus, and then missionaries go out all over the world. They proselytize. You have imamates in Oman, and you have imamates in North Africa, right? So that's a kind of traditional story, as some of my Omani friends, my Ibadi friends might narrate it. And then you have, a sort of scholarly analysis of some elements of that story that complicates some elements of that story. One of the complicating factors is that, like most traditions, if we assume that traditions evolve and develop, it doesn't seem like the tradition has developed into what we recognize maybe as Ibadism by the time of Jabir bin Zayd. Just from a scholarly perspective, right? Ibadis would have a different perspective, and maybe they're right. But from a scholarly perspective, I don't see the evidence that Jabir bin Zayd is an Ibadi proper. That doesn't mean he wasn't important to the movement, or that he wasn't some sort of quietist guy, articulating certain things. But you don't see a move. What you see is, like, from a scholarly perspective, you see circles of scholars who are largely meeting in secret. And Jabir bin Zayd seems to be a pretty important one. And some of these other scholars as well, like Abu Ubaidah, Hajj seem to be important as well. And that seems to coalesce much more gradually. So by about the 720s, 740s, 760s, we don't really know when they kind of figure out, like, oh, we're really different from all these other groups. We actually have a distinct set of ideas that makes us different from all these other groups. They're distinct from some groups. They're pretty sure that they're not the Azrakites. They're very sure, actually, that they're not the Azrakites, but that doesn't distinguish them very much from some of the other quietists, right? And in all of this, we get very conflicting information about Ibn Ibad. We don't really have very clear death dates for him. very clear birth dates for him. We don't have much evidence for him. We have these letters that are attributed to him, but again, from a scholarly perspective, it's difficult to say that to attribute authorship in that way, especially, people in the ancient world would attribute things that they wrote to their masters, because it's very arrogant for you to assume that you can write something yourself. You attribute it to somebody who's your master, because that's really where the information came from, right? This is a medieval way of thinking about authorship, which makes it very complicated for people in the modern world who are trying to figure out who wrote the thing and when and to what audience. We have a narrative that has developed within the Ibadi tradition, and then you have a scholarly sort of critique of that narrative that is trying to figure out from a modern perspective how the tradition develops. And it's very hard for a scholar to fit Ibn Ibad into that. So we have some speculation about who he might have been. And Madeline's article, where he speculates that he was a kind of separate group outside of the core group in Basra, maybe in Kufa, maybe he was imprisoned by the Caliph al-Mansur. And because of this imprisonment, sort of people began associating all of this group with his name. And then eventually that material was incorporated back into the mainstream group. And so maybe that term got incorporated back. This is all speculation. I mean, it's very well informed speculation, and it's very interesting speculation, but it is speculation. We don't have any evidence for this actually being the case. What we do have evidence for is that we don't have a lot of evidence about Ibn Ibad. We don't really know who he is.
And it's hard to find anything more than a paragraph written about him in Ibadi sources.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Ibāḍīs too have to try and figure out, well, why are we called Ibāḍīs? And we scholars aren't helping very much. We don't have any answers to that either.
No, too busy problematizing everything. But I just find that to be very interesting, the figure of Abdullah ibn Ibad and the fact that Ibadis are named after him, and where did that come from? I do see that maybe Jabir bin Zayd, being in Basra, maybe took a liking to some of the Muhakama or al-Sharat that were local. But as you mentioned, trying to make sense out of all of it in a linear fashion, just from my research is impossible. I'm not a scholar, and you're saying the same thing, so I'm just gonna have to take it as that. But
sorry, maybe just to add to the general picture, I think it's something that is very helpful to bear in mind, and I also have to recall it time and time again, is that the 8th century in particular is a time of huge changes and huge developments, and not just for the Ibadis. We have dozens, if not hundreds, of groups who are going through the same processes of boundary making, of community making, of trying to figure out, what they think, who they are, how it relates to other groups, also how important any of this is for daily life. So, for instance, if you look at parallel processes in what we could perhaps broadly call proto-Shi'i circles, you have dozens of groups that propagate, some sort of a claim to power or to prestige of the Prophet's family, but that family can be defined in various different ways. Large groups of people clearly defined it as containing both Alids and Abbasids. But you also have the question, of Talibids, for instance. So everyone descended from Ali's father, Abu Talib. You have the clan of the Hashimis and so on and so forth. But even beyond that, you have so many groups who differ over questions of, were the first successors of the Prophet, were they legitimate or not? Should it have gone directly to Ali or not? What was Ali's own stance on this? Did he basically, remove himself from, legitimate rule by, contesting these claims, or, by agreeing to the agreement with Muawiyah? That is something that, for instance, some of the Kharijites would say. And so you have, especially in places like Basra and Kufa, who were, of course, among the earliest foundations, so the earliest, Muslim cities, garrison cities, like these are the places, and a few others as well, where people, where you have actually pretty large numbers of Muslims congregating, because of course we're still in a context where Muslims are a tiny numerical minority. So that also explains why much of the tradition that we have comes from basically a handful of centers, and so you have all of these processes of religious development in general, the development of what would later become the science of hadith, for instance, the development of certain doctrines, the development of ritual and practice, and then also the development of all of these groups, trying to figure out how they relate to one another, and who they associate with, and who they separate from, and so on and so forth. And the Ibāḍīs, whoever they were at the time, and whatever they may have called themselves at the time, were one group in this, basically this sea of groups. And I think that also helps, recalling this helps to understand why the information is so complex and why it's so incredibly hard to try and extract what really happened.
Sounds like a lot of negotiating was going on in the early Islamic time. Needed some, maybe Trump could have helped get some of these deals through.
Oh God, yeah, the T word.
Bruce Lincoln has talked about religion as discourse, right? And I think there's a very helpful way of thinking about how religious people operate as a series of discourses that they are constantly engaged in, that try and negotiate a number of things, including power relations, but also doctrinal issues and ritual and all the things that Hannah mentioned. So,
and I think here actually
constant discourse, right?
Exactly, and I think for this actually, just because we spoke about him earlier, I think Najm Haider spoke about the development of Shiism in Kufa, and development through the sort of like the crystallization of ritual practices, related to prayer, related to pilgrimage, related to mosques as well, as sort of bounded spaces. I think is very useful, because he also focuses on the 8th century in trying to get a better understanding of all of these processes that are going on at the same time.
You reference his book a lot in your work, and actually made me want to kind of go check it out to see what it's about. I'm not big, but I haven't really looked too much into historiography. I think your book might have been the first that kind of I exposed myself to. But it's very interesting seeing how all these things play out when you look back at it. I know in the process you really don't see these things going on, but being that when you look at the historical record, it seems more clear than as it was going on. I'm not going to hold you guys up too much longer. I know you probably want to get on with the rest of your day. I greatly appreciate you two taking the time out to meet with me on this subject. For me, this was very enlightening. I love reading about the Khawārij and the Ibāḍīs, and I thank you guys for clarifying some of the misconceptions I may have had or things that weren't so clear. And I am excited and expecting to see what else you guys have coming out next.
Thank you, Taryn.
Thank you very much for having us.
Okay. And if you guys would like to share any work that you probably might be coming out with that we can look out for, anywhere that we can reach you. I know both of you two. I say guys, please excuse me. That's just the way that I talk. And when I'm speaking to women, I always hope that they don't get offended by when I say that. But I know you two both have academia edu pages that I will share. If there's anything that you're going to release anytime soon that you want to do free promo on, feel free.
Hannah, you want to go first?
Not really. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I just finished a book on sectarianism, so-called, that should be coming out in a year, which tries to take a general look at some of these things. And I'm working on an intro to Ibadism, actually. So that's sort of, yeah, thanks. That's kind
Finally.
That's kind of what I'm engaged in. You can find my email at the FSU Department of Religion website, and it's agaiser@fsu.edu. So yeah, that's where I am.
Okay.
Yeah. I've got a couple of articles coming out that deal with Kharijites specifically. One on, well, a figure who is very often considered a Kharijite, but who I think actually probably fits better into another sort of rebellious category. So this really, again, deals with questions of, who is called a Kharijite and for what reason, what do we do with this term, with this label, and can we find ways to sort of work a way around it and try to find out what's really going on. So that's coming out at the end of the year in Al-Usur al-Wusta, which is, brilliantly an open access journal. So it will be available for everyone, but I will also, once the articles appeared, put it on the academia site. And then I've got another one coming out perhaps next year. Hopefully that deals with more broadly with letters to rebels, so caliphal letters to rebels, rhetoric. Adam smiling, yeah, I figured. And sort of like one half of that article is devoted to a letter to a Kharijite, and so it looks at basically structures of offers, makes comparisons with the safe conduct, the Aman. And that sort of thing. We also, my project is putting on a conference this September, and the proceedings will hopefully appear not too long after. So that will be on a whole range of rebellions in the early Islamic period. But
hopefully it's going on YouTube.
Well, probably not, but the not the whole thing. I'm actually quite looking forward to in-person events at this stage. But the proceedings will also have papers on the Kharijites, and Adam and another scholar of Ibadi Islam will also contribute. So that's, I think, something to look forward to.
I've been working on it this week.
I do have one question. Will there ever be like a Ibadi Kharijite, as Adam called it in an interview he gave, reader or something, where there's like a compilation of kind of like the Omani, the book I showed you before the interview, Adam, where it was a compilation of different articles by people in Ibadi studies and other fields of research. I would be interested to see something like that, to where people can, people really don't know too much about these Omani, the books that I showed you, but I would like to see something available to the public, and this is just my own thoughts, where it's like a Ibadi Kharijite reader, where as many articles as you can fit with modern research in one book, where people can kind of use as a reference if they want to know, because the books that I use, the one that I showed you is an excellent reference for looking into Ibadi history, jurisprudence, and numerous topics. So I would like to see something like that if you want to think about something maybe in the future.
We probably do those separately.
Yeah.
No worries.
Yeah, like a Ibadi reader and a Khawārij reader. That Hannah and I, when we somehow acquire this thing called free time, we'll get to that.
Yes, we'll get to that. Yes.
Well, being that it took so long to kind of arrange this interview, I'm happy that you guys used your free time in order to speak to me. So, and I really hope to do this again. It was.